The night it happened, I thought I was saving someone. Instead, I destroyed my own life. People still whisper my name like a curse, and I can't walk into a room without feeling their eyes. Sometimes I wonder if I'd rather they hated me, or if they're right to.
Welcome to Reddit Toxic Family Telltales channel. New episode every day.
When did saving someone's life end up destroying yours? Let me tell you about the day everything I'd worked for, every late night, every exam, every dream of college, got ripped away. At my high school, the teacher workroom was off limits. And I don't mean you'll get a warning off limits. I mean instant detention if you so much as peeked in. It was basically sacred ground. Now, my AP Chem teacher, Miss Baker, was the kind of teacher you don't forget. She actually cared whether I understood the material, wrote me recommendation letters, and honestly, she was the only reason I even had a shot at college. But she had asthma, bad asthma, and it had been flaring up worse than ever that winter. I'd watch her stop mid-lecture, pull out her inhaler, take a couple quick puffs, and then keep going like nothing happened. Some days she'd have to sit down and wave us toward independent work just so she could catch her breath. We all pretended not to notice because nobody wanted her forced into medical leave. She was that good. One day, she joked about her new inhaler being so expensive it cost more than her car payment. And while she laughed, none of us really did, because everyone knew teachers weren't exactly rolling in money. She kept that stronger inhaler in the workroom, locked up, because the school said medications had to be in secure areas. That Thursday, I was staying after school to retake a test. I'd bombed the first one since my dad was in the hospital all week. Normally, no retakes were allowed, but Miss Baker, she made an exception. While I was bent over my test, she went to grab her inhaler from her desk, except it was empty. I saw her face change, saw her try to head toward the door, and then her body just gave out. She collapsed against her desk, gasping, wheezing so loud it sounded like a whistle gone wrong. Her lips were turning blue. My stomach dropped. I bolted to the door, shouting for help, but it was after 4. The building was a ghost town. The nurse? Gone home 30 minutes earlier. Through ragged breaths, Miss Baker managed to croak out, "Workroom, inhaler, shelf by coffee." That was all I needed. I sprinted 3 doors down, yanked open the forbidden door, and froze. Right there, spread across the big table, were all the AP final exams. Every single one, including mine. And in those 2 seconds, just 2 seconds, my brain latched onto the exact chemistry problems I'd been struggling with for weeks. Answers. Right there. My stomach twisted because I didn't want to see it, but I couldn't unsee it either. I shook it off, grabbed her inhaler, and ran. Miss Baker was barely conscious when I got back. Her hands were trembling so badly I had to hold the inhaler steady for her. 1 puff, 2 puffs, 3, and finally her chest started to rise and fall normally. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "You saved my life." But in that same instant, I knew. I just ruined mine. See, Cameron, my rival for valedictorian, son of a school board member and all-around smug jerk, had been wandering the hall and saw me come out of the workroom. And of course he wasted no time. By the next morning, he'd already reported me. I got summoned to the principal's office. Principal Harris sat there with security footage paused on the screen. Me walking out of the workroom, inhaler in hand. Miss Baker was there too, still weak but fighting for me with every word. "She saved my life," she kept repeating. "I would have died without her." The principal nodded like he understood, and then he pulled out a form. His voice was flat, rehearsed. "Regardless of intent, you were exposed to secure testing materials. The integrity policy is clear. All your semester grades will be voided. You'll have to retake everything in summer school if you want to graduate." It felt like my chest collapsed in on itself, like I was the one gasping for air. I begged. I didn't mean to look. I was saving her life, but he just shook his head. The rule exists precisely because intent can't be determined after the fact. Colleges have already been notified. Your acceptance will most likely be rescinded. Miss Baker broke down crying, blaming herself. "This is my fault. She's losing her future because she saved me." And do you know what he said? "The rule is the rule. Heroism is admirable, but academic integrity must be maintained." He printed out the forms, page after page after page. My name stamped on each one like a nail being hammered into my coffin. My hands shook so badly I couldn't even grip the papers. Miss Baker slammed her hand on his desk, vowing she'd resign if they followed through. But he didn't even glance up, just kept typing, clicking, printing. When he finally shoved the stack toward me, he said I had until tomorrow to sign. My legs felt like they might give out. Miss Baker practically had to drag me out of that office, tears streaming down her face. Outside, the hallway lights felt too harsh, too bright. Jasmine, my best friend, was waiting on a bench. The second she saw my face, she knew. No words needed. I tried to explain, choking out bits and pieces about my grades being erased, about my college acceptance being gone. But I couldn't hold it together. Jasmine pulled me into her arms as my knees buckled, and we sank to the floor. I sobbed into her shoulder while she rubbed circles on my back, whispering over and over, "We'll figure this out. We'll find a way." But in that moment, all I could feel was the crushing truth. Saving a life had just cost me my future. Miss Baker leaned against the wall like it was the only thing holding her up, her face pale and her hand trembling. She kept whispering, "I'm sorry," over and over until I pulled away from Jasmine to face her. I told her this wasn't her fault, that even knowing the fallout, I'd still run into that workroom to grab her inhaler. She shook her head fiercely, promising she wouldn't let this stand. But we both knew. She didn't have the power to change what had already been set in motion. The drive home felt endless, even though it was barely 10 minutes. When I stepped into the kitchen, Mom was spooning soup into a container for Dad at the hospital. She froze mid-motion the second she saw my face. The ladle dripped soup onto the counter while I stumbled through the story. She didn't understand at first. I had to repeat myself 3 times before it clicked. The container hit the counter so hard the lid popped off, soup splattering everywhere. She didn't even blink. Her phone was already in her hand, scrolling so fast I could hear the plastic clicks. For lawyers, she called for in less than 20 minutes, pacing grooves into the tile while I sat at the table staring at the spilled soup. Each conversation ended the same, her asking about payment plans, her voice growing smaller with every no. The numbers she scribbled on the back of an envelope just got bigger and bigger until finally she slammed the pen down and tossed her phone across the table. We drove to the hospital in silence, except for the sound of her knuckles popping as she gripped the steering wheel. When we walked into Dad's room, he was sitting up, watching the news. His smile dropped the second he saw us. Mom handed him the stack of papers like they weighed 100 pounds. He adjusted his glasses, reading slowly, page by page. With every sheet, the heart monitor next to him beeped faster. He kept asking about appeals, hearings, due process. He shuffled the papers again and again like the words might change if he read them enough times. Mom had to tell him 3 separate times that the lawyers said the policy was airtight. His face grew whiter with every reminder until the nurse came in, concerned about the spike on the monitor. We all forced fake smiles and waved her off until she left. Dad tried to straighten up in bed, but the movement made him wince. He leaned back against the pillows and said we'd fight this however we had to, even if it meant going public. Jasmine had already beaten him to it. My phone buzzed constantly on the way home with messages from a new group chat she'd started. 20 kids were already in it, sharing their own horror stories of zero-tolerance policies gone wrong. One kid's older brother had been suspended for carrying Advil. Another lost his soccer spot because his mom's car broke down and he was late. Patrick typed that his mom worked at the local paper and might get us coverage. Sarah said her dad had a friend on the school board who thought the rules were too harsh. Then someone launched a petition. 50 signatures rolled in within the first hour. By the time we pulled into the driveway, Jasmine had turned my private disaster into a movement. The next morning, walking through those school doors felt like walking into my own funeral. Students whispered and went silent when I passed. Teachers gave me pitying looks that cut deeper than any words. And then, of course, Cameron, waiting at my locker with that smug grin stretched across his face. Loud enough for everyone to hear, he said, "Should have followed the rules." Before I could even blink, Jasmine launched at him. I had to wrap my arms around her waist, dragging her back as she cursed him out. Cameron just laughed, strutting down the hall while everyone else watched like it was entertainment. That's when Logan Hood appeared, quiet, serious, motioning us into an empty classroom. He shut the door and slipped me a folded sheet of paper. Teachers had been calling him all morning, furious about what happened but too scared to speak up. On that paper, the names, emails, and phone numbers of every school board member. He pressed it into my palm and said, "Make them listen." Then he was gone. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from Miss Baker. She'd been summoned by the superintendent. She said she planned to take full responsibility, to beg them to reverse my punishment. I texted back telling her not to risk her job, but she replied instantly, "I can't live with this guilt." 3 long, dragging days passed. Meetings, calls, dead ends. Until finally, the phone rang. A voice on the other end introduced herself, Huang Guan from the local paper. She wanted my side of the story. Mom shook her head immediately, ready to shield me from the spotlight. But I grabbed the phone. People needed to know the truth. We agreed to meet the next afternoon at a coffee shop downtown. When I arrived, the place was buzzing with noise, but Huang had already staked out a corner table. Laptop open, recorder by her cup, yellow legal pad covered in notes. She stood to greet me, her handshake firm and grounding. I sat, and she slid a water bottle across to me before diving right in. "Start from the beginning," she said, pen ready. So I did. I told her about Miss Baker's asthma getting worse, about the nurse leaving at 3:30 every day even though after-school programs ran until 6. She stopped me there, eyes wide. "Wait, repeat that?" I said it again. She scribbled it down and underlined it 3 times. "Liability," I heard her mutter under her breath. She asked how far the nearest hospital was. 15 minutes on a good day, I told her. "More if you hit traffic." She shook her head, writing faster than I thought humanly possible. I described Miss Baker collapsing, lips blue, gasping like she was drowning in air. Huang's pen flew across the page. Then she asked about the workroom rule, how students weren't allowed in under any circumstance. I explained about the shelf by the coffee maker, where that $500 inhaler sat locked away instead of near her desk. She closed her notebook at last and looked me square in the eye. Her voice was steady, certain. "This is one of the worst policy failures I've seen in 20 years of reporting. And for the first time in days, I felt like maybe someone was finally listening. The next morning, I walked into school and froze. Right outside Principal Harris's office, Jasmine was standing tall with nearly 50 other students. They weren't yelling, they weren't chanting. They were just there, holding handmade signs in silence. Bright poster board with thick marker letters. She saved a life. Heroes don't deserve punishment. Jasmine spotted me and waved me over, but I shook my head. My stomach twisted. The last thing I wanted was to make things worse for myself. Then the office door creaked open. Principal Harris stepped out, and the second he saw the crowd, his face flushed a furious red. His voice boomed down the hall. You have 2 minutes to disperse or you'll all be in detention. No one moved. Not a single sign came down. That's when he pulled out his phone and barked something into it. Within minutes, 2 security guards appeared, ordering everyone to get to class. But someone was already filming. I caught at least 3 teachers peeking from their classroom windows. Mr. Peterson even gave Jasmine a quick thumbs up before disappearing back inside. The guards started taking names, and slowly the crowd dissolved. But the damage was done. The video was already spreading like wildfire online. I tried to push it out of my head and went to class. My phone buzzed nonstop under the desk with notifications as the video went viral. At lunch, Jasmine and I sat together. My phone buzzed again, this time an email. From my dream college. My hands shook as I opened it. The first line hit me like a punch. My acceptance had been officially rescinded. The reason? Academic integrity violation. They added a neat little sentence. While we understand the unusual circumstances, our policy does not allow for exceptions regarding test security. My chest caved in. Before I even realized what I was doing, I hurled my phone across the cafeteria. It smacked the wall and the crack of the screen echoed through the room. A new problem for Mom. Another bill we couldn't afford. Jasmine rushed me into the bathroom, gripping my arm while I stood there trembling, unable to breathe right. She kept whispering, "We'll figure something out. We'll figure it out." But things only got darker. Miss Baker didn't show up to school that day, or the next, or the day after. Mrs. Chun, the sub, told us Miss Baker had left detailed lesson plans and a note begging everyone to be understanding about my situation. Rumors flew. Some said she'd had a breakdown, others said she was in the hospital. Mrs. Chun insisted she just needed time. Half the class staged their own protest. Nobody opened their books, nobody took notes. Mrs. Chun eventually gave up and turned it into a study hall. Meanwhile, Mom met with Logan Hood to see if there was any way I could still graduate. He pulled out this giant binder, summer school options. 6 entire courses in 8 weeks. From 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. every day, even Saturdays. And the cost? $3,000. Not including books. The color drained from Mom's face. She asked about financial aid, but Logan shook his head. Summer school was considered remedial. No assistance available. Mom scribbled notes while I watched her doing the math in her head, her jaw tightening because we both knew we didn't have that kind of money. 2 nights later was the school board meeting. Cameron's dad stood at the podium like he owned the place. His speech was full of buzzwords. Academic integrity, fairness, consistency. He said making exceptions for emotional situations would create chaos in the system. Meanwhile, his wife sat next to him staring down at her lap, her whole body stiff with embarrassment. Someone in the back recorded the whole thing, catching the moment he said rules are rules 3 times in a row like it was some kind of sacred chant. Within an hour, the clip was online and the meme started. Marina, his wife, scooted her chair away from him as he sat down, like she couldn't bear to be seen next to him. The next day, as I was heading to my car, Mr. Flores, the janitor, called out. He walked over, trash bag still in hand, and looked me dead in the eye. "I saw everything," he said. "You crying while you helped Miss Baker breathe. In 30 years at this school, I've never seen anything as shameful as what they're doing to you." He pulled a little notebook from his pocket, scribbled his number, and tore out the page. Pressing it into my hand, he said, "Call me if you need a witness. I don't care if it makes Harris mad. Some things matter more." That night, Jasmine's mom called my house. She was a nurse, and she'd written a full medical assessment of Miss Baker's attack. She detailed exactly how many minutes a person could survive without oxygen in that state. Her conclusion was blunt. Miss Baker would have suffered brain damage or died if I had waited even 2 minutes longer. She'd already submitted it to the board and sent a copy to Hua, the journalist. A week later, I was at breakfast when Mom slid her phone across the table. Hua's article filled the screen. The headline screamed in bold, "Local student punished for saving teacher's life." The piece had quotes from medical experts, a breakdown of asthma emergency statistics, and a whole section on how zero-tolerance policies across the country were failing students. The comment section exploded, over 200 posts and climbing. People sharing their outrage, their own stories, demanding answers from the school. A petition had already hit 500 signatures. That afternoon, a school-wide email from Principal Harris landed in everyone's inbox. His message, a stiff defense of their decision, warning against trial by media. He echoed Cameron's dad almost word for word, about maintaining standards and avoiding chaos. But the only chaos I saw was the one they'd created. All day, teachers slipped up to me quietly, voices low. "We're disgusted by this. You don't deserve it." And then they'd pull back, afraid of being overheard. afraid of losing their jobs, afraid to break the rules. The evening after dinner, I was drying dishes when a knock echoed through the house. Mom opened the door, and there stood Marina Suarez, clutching her purse like it was armor. Before either of us could speak, she pressed a folded check into Mom's hand. I glanced down. My breath caught. It was the exact amount we needed for summer school fees, plus a little more. Mom stammered, trying to push it back, but Marina held her hands closed tight around the check. Her eyes glistened as she whispered, "Don't tell Clint." Then she spun on her heel and nearly sprinted back to her car. We just stood there, stunned, watching her taillights fade into the night. Mom's tears finally spilled, silent at first, then shaking her shoulders as she clutched that piece of paper like it was salvation. 2 days later, the superintendent's office called. They wanted a meeting with me, my parents, and Principal Harris. Dad left the hospital early, looking weaker than ever, and Mom gave up a day's pay. We sat in this cavernous conference room while the superintendent smiled like she was doing me a favor. She suggested I take a gap year and reapply to different colleges. I stared at her, numb. A gap year? That still meant everything I'd worked for had been shredded. She just kept nodding, her expression carefully sympathetic but empty of solutions. Harris sat smug and satisfied, like he'd already won. When Miss Baker finally came back that Monday, she looked broken. Her hair had grown out gray at the roots, dark circles carved under her eyes. She tried to teach, but students told me later she'd stop mid-sentence, staring at my empty desk until her voice cracked. Some said she burst into tears while explaining chemical bonds. Others said she spent every lunch break storming into administrator offices, begging them to reconsider. 3 times that week she even went down to the district office. No one listened. 2 weeks after this nightmare began, Logan Hood called. His voice held a spark of hope. 3 board members had pushed for a special session to review the policy. Clint Suarez fought tooth and nail against it, but he was outvoted 4-3. The hearing was set for Tuesday. That same night, Jasmine showed up at my house with her laptop and a stack of folders taller than my textbooks. We camped at the kitchen table, turning everything into a presentation. She built a timeline, second by second, from Miss Baker collapsing to the paramedics' arrival. We gathered witness statements, stacked them into neat files. Jasmine's mom contributed her medical report. Miss Baker would have died in under 3 minutes without her inhaler. We drilled my presentation until 2 a.m. every night. Dad even coached us through video calls from his hospital bed, helping us sharpen each argument. The night before the hearing, I ran to the grocery store for milk. That's where I ran into Cameron. No smirk this time, just him, staring at the floor in the dairy aisle, clutching a pack of energy drinks. He muttered that his mom had been fighting with his dad about the situation every night. Then he turned and left without another word. No apology, no victory lap, just gone. Tuesday evening, the boardroom was overflowing. Students packed every seat. Teachers lined the walls. Parents and community members pressed in wherever they could stand. My hands shook as I set up my materials, feeling every eye on me. When they called my name, I walked to the podium and laid it all out. The timeline, the medical evidence, the sound of Miss Baker's breathing, fading like a broken whistle. Photos of the workroom door, the long stretch to the nurse's office. I told them straight. Waiting for help would have meant watching her die. Then Miss Baker testified. She poured out months of frustration. How the rules forced her to lock away life-saving medication. How she'd begged for exceptions and been denied. Her voice cracked as she said she'd rather have died than watch me lose my future for saving her. She listed teachers with diabetes, heart conditions, others who lived with the same daily danger. The board members shifted, visibly uncomfortable. Then Clint Suarez rose. He thundered about policies, about precedents, about chaos. His words rang hollow, though, and right in the middle Marina stood up. Without a word, she walked out of the room. Every head turned to watch. Clint's face flushed deep red. He stumbled over his next sentence, and for once, his voice didn't sound so sure. Finally, the janitor, Mr. Flores, gave his testimony. He painted the scene as he'd seen it. Me crying, holding the inhaler to Miss Baker's lips as her skin turned purple. He declared it the most shameful thing he'd ever seen an administration do in 30 years. His voice thundered with conviction when he said, "What she did wasn't breaking rules. It was saving a life. And everyone knows it." The board whispered among themselves, papers shuffling, tension thick. 20 minutes felt like 20 years. Then the chairman called for the vote. One hand raised, then another, then another. When the 5th hand went up in my favor, the room erupted cheers, clapping, people crying and hugging. Clint gathered his papers and stormed out without even waiting for the vote to finish. The chairman banged his gavel, his voice firm. "Principal Harris, restore her grades immediately. Notify the college the violation has been reversed." Harris's jaw clenched so tight I thought it might snap. He opened his laptop right there, typing with stiff fingers. The printer whirred behind him, spitting out a confirmation sheet. He grabbed it, walked it over, and shoved it at me without ever meeting my eyes. The paper shook in his hand. I took it. Mom threw her arms around me in a crushing hug as applause thundered through the room. Miss Baker sobbed openly, this time tears of joy, and for the first time in weeks I felt like maybe, just maybe, My future wasn't lost after all. We sat through the rest of that board meeting, but honestly, I couldn't process a single word. My eyes kept dropping back to the paper in my hands. Asterisk, my grades restored, violation reversed, emergency exception granted. Asterisk, I must have read it 50 times, my fingers tracing those words like I was afraid they'd disappear. By the time we got home, it was nearly midnight. I didn't even change. I just collapsed onto my bed, still in the clothes I'd worn to the hearing. My phone buzzed all night with texts and calls, but I couldn't bring myself to look. Exhaustion swallowed me whole. The next morning at 8:30 sharp, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and nearly dropped it, the college admissions office. My pulse hammered as I answered. A calm voice on the other end apologized for everything, then said the words I'd been desperate to hear. My acceptance was reinstated immediately. They would rush my financial aid paperwork to make sure everything was ready for fall semester. I collapsed backward, phone pressed to my ear, tears streaming silently. Mom came running in, panic in her eyes, until she saw me nodding. Thumbs up, barely able to breathe through the relief. She snatched the phone from me and started peppering the admissions officer with questions about housing and orientation while I just lay there, sobbing quietly into my pillow. Then she called Dad at the hospital and put him on speaker so he could hear. The joy in his voice when I told him. It cracked something open inside me that had been locked up for weeks. That afternoon, I went back to school to clear out my locker. I'd been avoiding those halls like they were cursed, but I needed to face it. And Miss Baker, she must have been watching, waiting. The second she saw me, she ran down the hallway and pulled me into the longest hug. She was crying and laughing at once, telling me she'd already submitted a proposal for locked emergency med boxes in every hallway so no one would ever have to choose between rules and a life again. Then she pulled back, hands on my shoulders, her eyes red and swollen, and told me she was dedicating her Teacher of the Year award to me. "You've shown more courage than any adult in this building," she whispered. That broke me. I started crying, too, and we just stood there while kids walked past, some patting my back, others saying congratulations. Over the next few days, I noticed Cameron wasn't strutting around anymore. His head hung low, and he avoided all the usual spots. Rumors spread fast. People said Marina had screamed at him in their driveway about how ashamed she was of their family's role in all this. Apparently, she'd been sleeping in the guest room since the board meeting. His dad stopped showing up to board sessions altogether. Whispers floated that he might resign before his term ended. The other members were freezing him out after the fiasco. 2 weeks later, the board voted again, this time to officially rewrite the zero-tolerance policy. And with Clint gone, it passed 7-0. They wanted to name it after Miss Baker, but she refused. "It's not about me," she said. "Call it the emergency life safety exception. It's about protecting everyone." The local news ran with it. Asterisk, victory for common sense over bureaucracy. Asterisk, Miss Baker gave interviews, using the spotlight to push for broader reform. Logan Hood was appointed to head a new policy review committee. And then the stories started pouring out. Students stepping forward with their own scars from zero-tolerance rules. The district announced a full-scale policy review. Logan told me privately, "Your case opened the floodgates. People have been waiting years for this." Jasmine threw me a party to celebrate. When I walked into her house, I froze. Teachers were there, some I'd never even had as instructors, showing up just to support me. Miss Baker climbed onto a chair with a red solo cup and gave a speech about courage, about standing for what's right even when it costs everything. She toasted, the room roared, and we all tried to pretend we didn't see Principal Harris's car roll past the house twice. Someone joked he was probably looking for a reason to write us up. A week later, Dad finally came home after nearly 2 months in the hospital. The first thing he wanted to do? Thank everyone who had stood by me. He spent days handwriting letters to each board member who voted in my favor. He sent Marina a massive bouquet with a note thanking her for her quiet support and the summer school money that had kept me afloat. And then, with tears in his eyes, he said something I'll never forget. "Watching you fight through this while I was stuck in that hospital bed, it gave me something to hold on to. You didn't just save Miss Baker. You helped save me too." About a month after the board meeting, an envelope showed up in our mailbox. Thick, official looking, with a seal stamped on the front. Inside was a letter from something called the Moral Courage Foundation. They'd heard about my case, and they were offering me a scholarship. Not just any scholarship. One specifically for students who'd shown exceptional moral courage in difficult circumstances. And the amount? Enough to cover everything my financial aid didn't. Which meant for the first time in my life, college wouldn't mean debt hanging over my head, or Mom and Dad draining savings they didn't even have. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the numbers, my hands shaking, while Mom cried into a dish towel. The following week, Miss Baker waved me over after class. She led me into the hallway and pointed to a shiny red box bolted to the wall, the kind with a glass door like a fire extinguisher case. Inside were 3 different inhalers, each labeled with a teacher's name. "Emergency medication stations," she explained, her voice cracking. The district had fast-tracked approval after what happened. Now every hallway had one, secured with a 30-second access code that all staff knew. She pressed her hand against the glass and whispered, "Do you realize how many lives this will save? No student will ever have to choose like you did again." 2 days later, the superintendent's office called me in. I sat in her office while she leaned across the desk, telling me they were creating a new student advisory board to weigh in on policies, and they wanted me on it. My first proposal? Mandatory emergency medical training for all staff. The vote passed unanimously. Asterisk, even Principal Harris raised his hand. Asterisk. That same afternoon, my phone buzzed with a call from Marina. She asked to meet at a coffee shop downtown. When I walked in, she was already there, looking different, lighter. She told me she'd filed for separation from Clint. Watching me fight for what was right had made her realize she needed to fight for herself, too. Then she offered me something I never expected. A summer internship at her law firm, working on cases for students caught in unfair disciplinary messes. I said yes immediately. For the first time, Marina smiled so big it seemed like she'd been holding it in for years. The weeks blurred after that. Finals, graduation prep, everything moving faster than I could process. Then suddenly it was graduation day. The assistant principal pulled me aside and said the school wanted me to give a speech. Standing at that podium, staring out at hundreds of faces, my knees nearly buckled. But I found my voice. I told them that sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules, that systems need room for humanity, that a single life is worth more than any policy written on paper. In the front row, Miss Baker sat beaming, healthier than she'd looked in months, tears streaking her cheeks as she clapped. After the caps flew into the air, Cameron approached me. No smirk this time, no swagger, just him looking smaller somehow. He admitted his grades had tanked during all the chaos and he'd lost valedictorian. Then, quietly, he apologized. Said his mom had finally made him see what he'd nearly cost me. I accepted, but told him we'd never be friends. He nodded like he'd already made peace with that. The very next morning, Principal Harris sent out an all-staff email. He was taking early retirement after summer school. At the farewell assembly, he gave a carefully worded speech about how rigid policies sometimes failed to account for human complexity. Everyone knew he was talking about me, even if he never said my name. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was the closest thing I'd ever get. And honestly, it was enough. That summer at Marina's firm changed everything. She taught me how to dig through cases, how to build arguments, how to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. She admitted my case had been the final push she needed to leave Clint and practice the kind of law that mattered. Law that protected instead of punished. Together, we worked 3 student cases that summer. 3 kids who'd been crushed under zero-tolerance policies. And all 3, we overturned them using my case as precedent. For the first time, I didn't just feel like I'd survived my story. I felt like I was helping rewrite it for others. In August, just as I was packing for college, a thick envelope showed up in the mail. Inside was a handwritten letter from Miss Baker. She thanked me again and tucked in a photo of her with 5 smiling little kids, her grandkids at their elementary school graduation. She wrote that she got to see that moment because I saved her life. And she wasn't stopping there. She'd already launched a foundation to support students facing disciplinary action in emergency situations. 2 kids in other districts had already been helped because of her. A few days later, Logan called with updates. The district had hired a new principal, someone who had immediately started rewriting policies with compassion and context in mind. Teachers were buzzing with relief, finally allowed to use judgment instead of parroting rules. Logan said everyone knew my case had been the catalyst, and the new principal even mentioned it during her first staff meeting. That same week, I got an email from the National Education Reform Coalition. They wanted to feature my story in their campaign against zero-tolerance policy failures. I did a couple of phone interviews and 1 video call, but honestly, I was just trying to get ready for school. Later, they told me my story had directly contributed to policy changes in 3 other states, places where students like me hadn't been so lucky. The week before move-in, I walked the halls of my school one last time. Everywhere I looked, bright red emergency medication boxes were mounted every 30 feet. Through the glass doors, I could see inhalers, EpiPens, other emergency meds. And across each one was a sign that read, * break glass in emergency. No student will be punished. * the nurse's office now had extended hours until 6 p.m., and I saw her training 3 new assistants on emergency protocols. Logan found me and flipped open the brand new policy manual. On page 12, in bold, was a section titled Good Samaritan Protection for Students. It promised full protection for anyone helping in a medical crisis, no matter what rules had to be bent. That night, Jasmine threw me the biggest going-away party at her house. Teachers even showed up, some I'd never had in class, all wanting to celebrate. Miss Baker climbed onto a chair, raised her red solo cup, and gave a speech about courage and doing the right thing, even when it costs you everything. The room erupted in cheers. Marina even arrived with champagne and a cake the size of a coffee table. Future lawyer, piped across it in frosting. She pulled me aside to tell me her divorce from Clint was final, and she'd launched a non-profit legal aid group for students caught in unfair discipline. I want you to work with me every summer through law school, she said, pressing a business card into my hand. The next morning, Mom and Dad loaded up the car for the 5-hour drive to campus. Dad looked healthier than he had in years, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. He admitted that watching me fight the system had given him something to focus on during chemo, something that helped him push through treatment. Mom reached back, squeezing my hand, whispering that nothing had ever made her prouder. At freshman orientation, I introduced myself to my new roommate, and she froze. Then her eyes widened. Wait, you're that girl? I read about you in 3 different papers. I can't believe I get to room with someone who actually stood up instead of just ranting online. We stayed up until 3 a.m. that night swapping stories. Miss Baker started sending me monthly emails with updates. Her health was improving, and she'd become a fierce advocate for teacher health accommodations, working with the district to expand insurance coverage for chronic conditions. In October, she told me she'd been invited to speak at a state education conference. Her topic? How rigid policies can kill. She said she was dedicating it to me. That same month, I was invited to speak at a national education reform conference. 200 people. Policymakers, superintendents, reform leaders, staring up at me while I told them the whole story. Saving Miss Baker, being punished, and fighting back. When I finished, they handed me an honorarium check big enough to cover all my textbooks for the year, with money left over for spring. Meanwhile, Marina's nonprofit was thriving. They'd already challenged and overturned 3 zero-tolerance cases in our district using my case as precedent. One night she called, her voice lighter than I'd ever heard it, to ask if I'd join her advisory board. Your case changed my entire life direction, she said. By spring semester, I was pulling straight A's again, juggling classes with volunteering at the campus legal aid clinic and speaking at 2 more conferences. Professors kept telling me I had a gift for advocacy. One even wrote me a glowing recommendation that landed me a summer internship at a major civil rights law firm. By May, Marina's nonprofit had helped 14 students beat unfair punishments, all using strategies born from my nightmare. And for the first time since that day in the chemistry classroom, I realized something. Saving Miss Baker's life hadn't just changed my future. It had changed everything. As I packed up my dorm room after finals, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my transcript with its perfect string of A's and the stack of thank you letters from students Marina's nonprofit had helped. And it hit me something huge. That day in the chemistry classroom, the day I thought had destroyed my future, wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning. The day I saved Miss Baker turned out to be the day that saved me, too. It revealed what I was meant to do with my life. It taught me how to stand up to broken systems, how to fight when the odds were stacked against me. And it connected me with mentors like Marina, who showed me that fight could be turned into real change, not just for me, but for countless others. Sometimes the worst day of your life becomes the foundation for every good thing that comes after. Sometimes saving someone else's life ends up saving your own in ways you never could have imagined.
Thanks for watching. Today's train wreck is over, but tomorrow's ride is already on track. Subscribe so you don't miss it.